Before we get started, I just want to say that the links to purchase both consoles will be linked both in the comments section and the description. Anyway, the Steam Deck has officially made its debut into the handheld gaming market and is already stealing the attention away from the OLED Nintendo Switch model, as well as many other new handheld entries. But how well does Valve's Steam Deck compare specifically against the GPD Win 3? Well, first of all, let's try and understand the specifications because the hardware inside is the most important factor after all. The Steam Deck is without a doubt one of the best handhelds released this year, and that's only exemplified through its CPU, which is an AMD Zen 2, although admittedly, as of current, we don't know the exact model. What we do know is that it will have a total of 4 cores and 8 threads, meaning you can expect between 2.4 and 3.5 GHz frequency, which is a pretty respectable amount in all honesty. You won't be playing in max graphics or have 2 games open at once either, so for the simple use of playing one game in low to medium graphics on a small screen, that CPU, whatever it might be, will be more than capable of running any game. As a matter of fact, Valve have confirmed that the Steam Deck is actually able to run every single game on Steam at a bare minimum of 30 FPS, and in most cases, even higher. Let's also consider the 16 gigabytes of LPDDR5 RAM as well. You may be aware of what that is, or you may not, but what it boils down to is faster and more energy efficient RAM, meaning you get better in-game performance as well as a slightly longer battery life. When it comes to the SSD, however, it is slightly less impressive because it ranges from just 64 gigabytes up to 512. Naturally, the 64 gigabytes is considerably cheaper at just $400. But regardless of price, that won't be enough space to facilitate large games, so you're either going to have to get the $650 512 gigabyte model, or you're just going to have to pay for extra storage later down the line, which will likely work out to be more expensive. However, I can say that for the high-end model, 512 gigabytes is a fair amount of storage and will suffice for a handheld. Much like the CPU, the GPU isn't actually fully disclosed, as in, we don't really know what it'll be. But they have said that it'll be an AMD RDNA 2. Naturally, that means it's bound to be pretty decent, or at least decent enough to allow smooth gameplay on a screen that only has a resolution of 1280 by 800 pixels. Compared to the GPD Win 3, the Steam Deck has vastly different hardware because while Valve went down the AMD route, GPD has done the opposite and opted for Intel hardware. Inside the Win 3, you can expect to see an 11th generation Intel Core ranging from an i5 to an i7. The lesser model costing $1,160 and the higher model costing just $150 more at $1,310. Both of which cost around double the Steam Deck. It's notable that although the GPD is extremely expensive in comparison, the i7 CPU is hugely impressive, which in some cases could justify the price to an extent. For a device that only has a 5.5-inch screen, an i7 11th gen is pretty overkill as it has a frequency that can reach up to 4.7 GHz, so it's unlikely that the Steam Deck's AMD CPU will be able to compete, taking into consideration the price difference. However, while the CPU is definitely better in the Win 3, the same can't be said for the GPU because it only has an Intel Iris Xe. Those graphics cards don't really have the best reputation as being very reliable. Although in a small handheld, it should get the job done because at the end of the day, the screen you play on will limit how much you can push your in-game graphics. You're probably going to be playing on low settings, so the GPU is somewhat less relevant compared to other components, but regardless, the one inside the Steam Deck is most likely better than Intel's integrated Iris graphics from my standpoint. The Win 3 also sports 16 gigabytes of LPDDR4 RAM, which is really good. Not gonna dispute that, but it's 1.5 times slower than the LPDDR5 RAM that the Steam Deck has, so it can't really compare on that front. The Steam Deck just has the better RAM. Although the GPD has doubled the SSD space at exactly 1 terabyte, so it makes up for that. Conclusively, the specs of each device are pretty mixed because while the GPD definitely will have the better CPU and SSD space, the Steam Deck has a better GPU and RAM. In more simple terms, for the GPD, the specs translate to performance levels of around 70 to 80 FPS in most games when played on low settings. It's a little hard to directly compare in-game performance with the Steam Deck since there aren't many cases, but games supposedly never dip below 30 FPS, which is certainly promising because that means games should run smoothly at 30. In most cases, sit somewhere above that mark. Since specifications aren't that easy to grasp, perhaps understanding what each device has to offer might help differentiate the two. Both have very, very different designs and features. I can say that neither are blatant ripoffs of the Nintendo Switch's design, like so many are these days. First of all, the Win 3 has the slide-down keyboard, and then there's the Steam Deck that has the trackpad, so both do a fair bit to offer a unique selling point. That's part of what makes each of them great. But let's start with the Win 3 first of all. The most immediate thing that pops out to anyone seeing the GPD Win 3 is the size of it because it is a remarkably small device. The screen is 5.5 inches, which is about as big, if not smaller, than your average smartphone. The device as a whole sits at 7.8 by 3.62 inches and a thickness of just around 1 inch. Now, there's two things you could say about having a handheld that small. Some might say it's incredibly portable because it's light and will fit into any pocket. But for most, I feel as if a 5.5-inch screen just isn't enough to cut it. Being able to play a AAA 3D game on that screen will be tedious, to put it lightly. For me, that design choice wasn't a particularly good idea because it alienates a lot of people who like the idea of the GPD but want a larger device. Compared to the Steam Deck, I think the GPD really falls short because of that. The Steam Deck has a generous 7-inch screen, which is about half an inch larger than the Switch's, and the whole device is much larger. Naturally, that will be harder to transport around because it's unlikely to fit in most pockets comfortably, but on the flip side, it's way easier to play on because the screen is a usable size and the controls are much larger. Speaking of controls, the Steam Deck also has a very particular layout which we haven't seen on any other handheld device so far. It has a horizontal thumbstick layout, same as the Win 3, but what's cool about it is that just underneath the thumbsticks are two valve-styled trackpads similar to the ones found on the Steam controller. I personally don't like trackpads because for gaming, they don't tend to be great, although Steam trackpads are a different story because they're not only convenient for all purposes, they're also pretty accurate in-game too. Aside from that, you have the standard controller layout you'd expect with the D-pad and the ABXY button mash, but also an additional 4 triggers located on the back of the controller within reaching distance of your fingertips. So essentially, the Steam Deck grants you extra control over your games with those additional triggers and trackpads. It pretty much gets you as close to a mouse and keyboard-like advantage as it can on a handheld device, so props to Valve for that. Very well-designed device overall. As for the Win 3, the layout is very similar, with the exception of those trackpads and additional 4 back triggers. It's a good layout, but my issue is the size because it's fiddly at times. Also, the slide-down keyboard, although it is very cool and definitely helpful to have on a Windows 10 device, the keys are extremely small, so it's not great for typing. Again, I think it comes down to the fact that it's just too small of a device. It has all the right design choices and fantastic features like the fingerprint sensor, great controls layout, and a keyboard, but they all need to be bigger. For a Windows device, it's far too small. That's why, in my opinion, the Valve Steam Deck is the better handheld. It uses its own Steam operating system that grants access to every game imaginable and is capable of running all of those games smoothly. Better yet, it does so on a larger and better designed device, which is half the price, I might add. Anyways, what do you think? Be sure to check the comment section and description to take a look at these devices for yourself. Also remember to like and subscribe.